Our topic today is Winning the West, the Revolver. I'm Scott Turner. I'm Director of Science Programs here at the NAS. And I'm guest hosting for David Randall, who's your usual host and couldn't be with us today. We're going to open up the floor to our panelists momentarily, but I just first wanted to give everyone here an idea of what's going to happen during today's event. I'll be introducing our speakers very soon, and they'll each will have a presentation, typically 12 to 14 minutes or so to speak, to introduce the topic. And after our panelists are finished, I'm going to be moderating the questions. I'm not a historian or a lawyer, so this is a bit out of my wheelhouse. So I'm mainly going to stay out of the way and convey questions from you, the audience, to our panelists. I would like to invite you to submit questions at any time during the event. You don't have to wait until our panelists are finished with their remarks. We prefer actually that you can put your comments in the Q&A box, which is located down at the bottom of your screen. We just like the Q&A box because it's a little bit more interactive, but of course, if you put something in the chat as well, that's no problem. We will get to it. And if the questions don't get answered, if we don't have time to get to all the questions, I'd like to invite everyone to just send them to me at my email address. That's turner@nas.org, and we'll forward those questions to the panelists. One final thing, we're recording this event, and once we're done, there'll be a link to the video on YouTube, and there'll be a link to that recording sent to you at the email address that you used to register. So thank you very, very much for joining us for this event. It's going to be very interesting. And let me just introduce our panelists. First off, out of the mark is going to be John Bainbridge. He's a freelance writer and former reporter for the Baltimore Sun. And he's also legal affairs editor for the Maryland Daily Record. He's the author of several books, including Gun Barons, The Weapons That Transformed America and the Men Who Invented Them. And he's the co-author of American Gunfight, The Plot to Kill Harry Truman and the Shootout That Stopped It. And I had no idea that actually was a thing. He wrote this with Pulitzer Prize-winning film critic and novelist Stephen Hunter. He's an attorney by profession, and he's practiced law in the public and private sectors, and he served as a law clerk for judges on Maryland's highest court. Ashley Clements, sorry, I mispronounced your name. Ashley Lubinsky is a highly regarded curator and historian, and she's known for preserving and interpreting historical firearms. Over the past 15 years, she's researched and worked with renowned firearms collections, such as the Smithsonian Institution's National Firearms Collection and the Buffalo Bill Center of the West's Cody Firearms Museum. Ashley has spent a decade working for and running the CFM, the Cody Firearms Museum, where she served as the curator in charge. In 2022, Ashley co-founded the University of Wyoming College of Law's Firearms Research Center. So welcome, John, and welcome, Ashley. We're really pleased you're here. And without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to our first panelist, John Bainbridge. John, take it away.
Right. Thank you very much. I think the subject obviously is the revolver. And what is a revolver except something that is a gun that shoots multiple times without having to be reloaded? In other words, each cylinder on the thing has chambers in it that are loaded separately. And when you cock the hammer and the chambers, the revolver revolves and it shoots. Why this is important is that through the centuries, soldiers have always wanted to be what's called force multipliers, or armies, because you take one soldier and you have an old-fashioned gun, you load it up, it shoots one time, and then you have to reload it. And that's a process that takes time, it takes concentration, and mistakes can happen. But anyway, you're one shot and you're done. The revolver is a little different. because you're able to shoot it once and you're able to shoot it again and again and again. Now, that was the first significant step in shooting firearms. And Colt, Samuel Colt, who I think Ashley's going to be talking about in more detail, was a fella who, I guess, made it a success here in this country. There have been revolvers before, but they weren't like Colts. Colts, you could, as I said, you could cock it, and the cylinder would turn, and it would lock into place all in one motion. It really got its first, I guess, bath in combat back in early June of 1844, when a bunch of Texas Rangers, about 15 of them in all, encountered a band of about 75 Comanche Pennsatucky Indians. And that was in the Texas Hill Country, about 80 miles or so northwest of San Antonio. And the Comanches and the whites were battling back and forth, raiding parties, both misbehaving, both doing like honorable combat at the same time. But when the Texas Rangers came upon this group of Comanches, they were very, very much outnumbered. The one thing that they had in their favor was that each of the 15 had with him one of Colt's little marvelous inventions. And the reason he had it is that Colt had been making revolvers since 1837. And he couldn't really get much success in selling them to various military. But one group that bought it was the Republic of Texas, which, you know, back then in the early 1840s, Texas was an independent republic. And apparently somebody there took a shine to these newfangled revolvers, and they bought a bunch of them, I think 360. Well, the Texas Navy, which actually contracted for them, got disbanded, and the Texas Rangers got a bunch of the leftovers. So they were carrying these guns. Each man had a revolver, and each man had a separate cylinder already loaded, ready to be swapped out in battle if you could keep your wits about you. Well, the result was that the Comanches charged and the Texas Rangers fired. And the Comanches dropped and the Rangers kept shooting. Eventually, the Comanches retreated to a different, a bit farther away. They didn't understand how all this group of Rangers could shoot so much. They just never encountered that before. One of the Comanches later who said it felt like each man had a shot for every finger on his hand. Then they regrouped and were going to go try again. They weren't sure how many shots the Rangers had. Well, the Rangers didn't have that many left, so they weren't sure what to do, except maybe. And the Indians at that time were out of range for the pistols, but they were not out of range for a rifle. So one of the Rangers, a fellow named Ad Gillespie, who had actually been lanced through, he had enough presence of mind and wits about him, as well as fortitude, to say, I'll take a shot. And the theory was that if you could knock out the chief, maybe they'd be done. At least that was the thought. So he put a rifle out, his rifle, put the little front sight in the V notch, shot off, and got the chief, and all they went. And the Comanches took off, leaving, I think, like 23 dead and a bunch of others wounded. And there was one Ranger killed, who was a German immigrant, and a couple of people wounded, including a fellow named Samuel Walker, who eventually played a big role in Samuel Colt's future. The leader of the of the Rangers wrote to the War Department of Texas, essentially praising Colts Revolver. He said, without that, we don't know what would have happened. They did excellent execution, I think was his term. So there was the revolver's birth, really, in American history. As I say, it had been around before, but not with the kind of precision that Colt's Revolver. Unfortunately for Colt, the Battle of Walker's Creek, which I said was in June of 1844, that took place 2 years after Colt's company went bankrupt. So there were no more Colt revolvers being made. Colt then teamed up with a fellow named Samuel Walker, who was one of the Rangers at that battle with the Pennsylvania Comanche. And they devised a new gun, which was a behemoth of a handgun. It weighed 4 pounds, 9 ounces, a great big thing to be carried in pairs on horseback. And eventually he got a government contract for that gun, which he contracted. He didn't have a factory to make it. He didn't have anything except a contract. And he convinced Eli Whitney, who was the son of the cotton gin inventor, or man credited with the cotton gin, who was now making guns, to help him. And they made guns. And eventually 1,000 of them found their way into the Mexican War. And from that moment on, Colt was set because the government wanted more of his revolvers. It was a much improved gun. They wanted more of them. And so he refined them and got a factory of his own in Hartford, Connecticut. And he was off and running. That's the beginning of the revolver. Now, the Mexican War, interestingly enough, Samuel Walker, the person who helped Colt invent the revolver that made his fortune, or at least started him on the way to making a fortune, was a very brash young Texan, originally from Maryland, who was quite charismatic, and he was killed in a battle, one of the last battles of the Mexican War. He was killed shooting his Colt revolvers, and so he went down, but it didn't matter to Colt anymore because Walker was dead, but Colt's dream finally was alive. One of the things that Colt did, once he got really rolling, was he would defend his patent. He had this patent, as I said, for a revolver that was very efficient for its time. But other people wanted to make a revolver too. One of the things about the United States at that time was there was a lot of litigation involving patents. And some people wanted to create a gun that would compete with Colt. Well, Colt was ready. And one of the guns that competed with Colt was patented by a fellow named Edwin Wesson. Now, Wesson, you may know, is a very familiar firearms name. But Edwin Wesson was the brother of the Daniel Baird Wesson, who became a firearms titan. But he had invented, supposedly, a revolver that worked more efficiently, that worked as well as Colt's and didn't infringe on his patent. He didn't get the patent until after he died, but his brother Daniel, with another company called the Massachusetts Arms Company, decided to make it. And so they began to prepare themselves to launch into the marketplace with this new revolver. And it looked very different from Colt's, but there was enough similarity that Colt said, I'm not going to let this happen. So he hired a very high-priced lawyer named Ned Dickerson, who was quite an imposing fellow, stood 6'3", had a golden voice, knew patents, and was a hell of a litigator. So just months after the Wesson and Levitt revolver went into market, Colt went into court and he filed a suit, and it began to attract attention. People all over the place, all over the country, were beginning to pay attention to Colt's litigation. So Colt had this fancy lawyer. Massachusetts Arms Company realized they had everything at stake. Frankly, Colt had everything at stake too, because if he lost, he would have lost his marketplace, lost the market. Massachusetts Arms Company would realize if they lost, they'd probably lose the company. So they hired another fancy lawyer named Rufus Choate, politician, very skilled, courtroom litigator, who one newspaper called a great galvanic battery of oratory. And they went into court and battled it out, and Colt won. He won in part because there was some argument that Colt had made. He had come up with other, he had used other revolvers. There have been other ones that were made that preceded his, and if that's the case, then he wouldn't have a good claim to a patent. But apparently a piece in one of the revolvers that his team had offered for evidence looked like, it turned out to have been a new part made to look old, and that sort of destroyed their credibility. Anyway, Colt wins. The message goes out: if you tamper with Colt's patent, be in for a fight. Be ready to face this Ned Dickerson. By the way, Colt gave fancy revolvers to Ned Dickerson in thanks for he would give gifts of engraved and fancy revolvers all over the place. Fast forward to a new era, only a few years, and something happens that changes the marketplace. Old revolvers like Colts had cylinders that you had to load from the front. You had to put powder and ball, and then you had a cap at the end, and then you'd ram them home with a ramrod. You had to do that several times, one for each cylinder, one for each chamber in the cylinder, and then you could shoot. But something happened in the 19th century, started in Europe, but it was picked up here, making a self-contained cartridge. That means you put all the makings of a bullet, a cartridge, into one unit. You have a case, you have the powder inside the case, and you have a projectile and some way of igniting it, like a small fine powder along the rim. Well, that's kind of revolutionary. That means you could load in one simple step. Let me show you what I'm talking about with the Colt Revolver. Now, I'm going to show you a revolver, but I can tell you it's an antique. There hadn't been anything in it since the 19th century. It's not going to go off, so don't worry about it. But here is what's called an 1851. This is what Colt was making starting in 1851. And each time you cock the hammer, as you can see, the cylinder revolves, setting up the next shot. These little parts on the things at the top were a little hole there with a pin. That's where you put a percussion cap with sensitive powder. And you had to load it by putting this roll down, and you ram the ball and the powder. You ram the ball on top of powder this way, and now you're ready to shoot. That's Colt's Revolver. Well, long ago, Smith and Wesson decided they would want to get into the act. They couldn't make any revolver. Nobody could that operated like a Colt with a locking cylinder. But there was a fella named Roland White. I hope I'm not losing people. Roland White invented something. He invented, or supposedly he invented, a thing called a bored-through cylinder. That means the cylinder goes all the way through. You don't have that with the Colt Revolver. That means you could put a cartridge in. Now, a lot of Roland White's ideas were kind of screwy. I mean, he did invent a loom machine. He had other decent inventions. But this one attracted the attention of Daniel Baird Wesson because of the bored-through cylinder. Roland White got a patent for it in 1855. Couldn't do anything with it because Colt's patent was still in force. That was good until 1857. It was due to expire in February of 1857, Colt's patent for the revolving cylinder. Colt was trying to get it extended. He'd gotten that once before. So far, he wasn't making headway, and he didn't get it extended. So Smith and Wesson decided they're going to start gearing up, and they're going to make he's going to make the revolver with a bored-through cylinder. And they started doing this in early 1850, and 1860. And the first one they turned out was a teeny little gun. And I'll show you this one too. Again, antique. It doesn't fire anymore. You see how tiny it is? This was their big invention. What you do is, here, I'll show you. You lift up here, and there you have this teeny weeny little cylinder, 22 caliber, but you can see the holes are straight through. So you load each one of these, they call it a 7-shooter, shot 7 times. And then you put it back on here, close it up, and you're ready to go. You can load that thing very quickly. It was teeny, but you could carry it discreetly in a purse or in your pocket. And Smith and Wesson began to get a lot of sales. And Colt couldn't make that because he didn't have the patent to the bored-through cylinder. So you had a wonderful situation with again, the patents were extremely important. Um, you just think about that. There are, I don't know, how much time do I have left?
Uh, we're approaching 16 minutes, but go
Oh,
ahead.
I'll shut myself up. I don't want to
No,
intrude.
no.
I don't
Don't
want to
shut up.
intrude.
Tell us more.
I was what this, what this was again, these patent wars. This happened all the time. Colt went into against a lot of other people, and so did Smith and Wesson. They went in against a lot of other people. But patent law was essential for the development of industry in this country. And property was promoted by a legal system that broadened the rights of a property owner. Well, the patents were essential to that. Anyway, I will shut up.
Thanks, John. I'm sure we're going to have more come out in the discussion. And just to mention a couple of things. I mentioned at the introduction that John has published a couple of books, and I put links to those books in the chat box, and I'll be putting us some links for Ashley as she makes her remarks as well. But I would like to encourage everyone to put in comments or questions. One has already come in, and I'm just going to share it right now. It's from Dave Peterson. He was apparently triggered by seeing those weapons that you showed. He says, "I'm traumatized for life, and it's all your fault." But more seriously, he's actually used one of those 1851 Colt revolvers. So it was much appreciated that you displayed those things.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine who's an intellectual property lawyer who shoots one of the original 1851 Navies. He loves it. Anyway, again, I apologize to Ashley. I didn't see any little warning that I was over my time. My apologies.
No, there's plenty of time. No apologies necessary. But with that, let's go to Ashley. Ashley, take it away.
All right. Well, I have to say that I'm very excited to hear that John likes patents as much as I do. It always sounds like a really boring field, but especially in terms of the firearms design market in the middle half of the 1800s, it gets very dramatic. And I have to say that Smith & Wesson was litigious, but they were also really smart because Roland White had that patent for the bore-through cylinder, and they made an agreement that he had to defend the patent. And that way it absolved Smith & Wesson of having to do that. And if you're aware of your American history, we go into a war and it becomes very difficult to stop people from copying your design when you have to produce a ton of arms for a military effort. But thank you, John. That was a perfect kind of cue up. I'm going to try in like 10 minutes to go over the rest of Colt history up through like today. But I wanted to touch on a bunch of things. And this 1850s period is so important to kind of the diversification of the revolver market. As John mentioned, Colt wasn't the first to make a revolver. There were repeating firearms. There were revolving firearms before his 1836 patents in the US. But he had the monopoly over the actual successful revolver that was used both in the military and also in the commercial market. And so everyone's kind of really excited to be able to get in on the action. And so as John mentioned, Smith & Wesson is kind of the key player as the patent expires initially. And Smith & Wesson also bide their time. They develop a metallic cartridge, but then they also invent the lever action, which ultimately goes to be associated with Winchester. So you see kind of cross-pollination in all of the firearms designers. But the other thing that's interesting with Colt is just because you were the first, quote unquote, doesn't mean you kind of sustain in terms of your design. And as John mentioned, the bore-through cylinder is a real game changer for Smith & Wesson. But both companies, and then ultimately Remington and a lot of other firearms companies, do find success with the revolver, especially leading into the Civil War. Sam Colt's an interesting figure in general, and I'm sure we'll talk about him later, but he's not a very likable figure necessarily in American history. And he's also not the only designer working on these firearms during his lifetime and then also after his lifetime. And an interesting anecdote for Samuel Colt is that the company actually has to go through an attempted rebrand leading into the Civil War because Samuel Colt gets caught selling to both sides. Not caught, he was allowed to at that point, selling to both sides during or leading up to the American Civil War, which really was a big issue, obviously, for the North. And he had to, I think he threw a parade. He did all kinds of stuff to try to repair his image. And he also got a military designation, although he wasn't very well liked. And he used that as an opportunity to really pitch his revolving rifles, which he really liked. But as John showed with the revolver design, with a pistol, you're holding it back on the grips. With a rifle, you're going to be resting a hand in front of that cylinder, and that is potentially problematic. So you won't see a lot of his revolving rifles and shotguns get a lot of success. But I think what's also important during this time frame is that you stop talking about Sam Colt and you really start talking about Colt. And the reason for that is that Samuel Colt dies in 1862. And I think a lot of people don't know that. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, because one of the most iconic revolvers in Colt history is the Colt Model 1873, the single action army. And I think people don't necessarily realize or think that Samuel Colt has nothing to do with that. And after his death, there's a lot of really interesting history. I won't get into it because we don't have the time. But the person that I tend to credit with the legacy and the myth and, kind of the larger than life persona of Samuel Colt is actually his wife, Elizabeth Hart Jarvis Colt. And I had to look over at my notes to make sure I didn't invert the names because there's a lot of names there. But Elizabeth is actually a very, very important player in the Colt factory. She runs the Colt factory with another designer during the Civil War, after the war. And she goes as far as building this church for the workers at Colt that has all of these different firearms elements. But in the back of the church, there's two large stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes. And instead of just a standard figure in the biblical scenes, she infuses images of Sam Colt as those biblical characters. So she herself is a character. And really, I think the kind of, embodiment of how we remember Sam Colt, how we remember Colt today. But the firearm I kind of want to transition to is that Model 1873, because Colt as a company does ultimately get the opportunity to make a firearm where you can load from behind the cylinder. So their version of a bored through cylinder. And you see that in the 1873, and that's designed by William Mason and Charles Brinkoff Richards. And those are also some fascinating characters. I wish you could tell stories about every designer, because they have some dramatic moments in their careers as well, including William Mason going to Winchester to compete against Colt at one point about a decade later. But they developed this single action army, and they do so with the hope of getting military contracts. And they go head to head with Smith and Wesson in the 1872 government trials. And they are ultimately very successful with that. But the Model 1873 is not just successful for the military. We've talked about the military a lot, but during the war, soldiers privately purchased handguns as well. And so there was a civilian market for the revolver before the 1873 and certainly after the 1873. And so you see kind of this split off. And part of that's because, especially after the war, there's a diversification of all product lines. So you don't just have one gun that does everything, like your long rifle, where you've got that for hunting, target shooting, defense, the military in some circumstances. Now you can buy individual guns, individual calibers for those firearms for specific reasons. And you see that, broadening out with even the variations alone in the Model 1873. And actually, I pulled kind of a statistic to show how popular this was in the civilian market, which is by 1892, there were 144,000 single actions that were shipped, and only 37,000 of those were for the government. So you see that this is popular kind of all over the country. And that's also where you start to get kind of the image of the Colt handgun as a symbol of the American West, because that's certainly something that is going out west, although it is also expensive. So it's going out west with specific types of people, and you do start seeing it with law enforcement as well. So you've got the 1873, it's iconic. Between 73 and 1940, you have almost 400,000 of these firearms made. And Colt's not just making those. Colt gets into the market to make a double action or multiple double actions to compete with other revolver companies. And a double action is the simple way of describing it is the trigger does two actions. So with a single action, what John showed, you have to cock the hammer and then press the trigger in order to fire the gun. With a double action, the pressing of the trigger cocks the hammer, rotates the cylinder, and fires the gun. So see, I did it too. I almost was Sam Colt. So Colt evolves as other companies evolve in order to compete with it. And then Colt also becomes very, very well known for their semi-automatic, the Model 1911. So you see the revolver still being made, but obviously Colt moves on as a company to make semi-automatics and machine guns. And they make the 1873 through 1940. And this is known as the first generation of Colts. And then they won't really get involved until after the World War II period, which is also very important for the history of the single action revolver, as well as Smith & Wessons and Remingtons. They all kind of play a huge role in that post-World War II period. But Colt, they struggle with bankruptcy. They struggle with a lot of stuff throughout all of their history. And sometimes they even struggle to be the first ones to their own market, which is after World War II, there's a resurgence in Western pop culture. And the Colt was used in the first Western in 1903. So it had that kind of pop culture iconism all the way back there. And so people are watching television Westerns, they're watching movie Westerns, and there's a whole consumer market now that wants to have these Western firearms. And the first two companies that sell Colt type single actions, so very similar to the original model 1873, are a company named Great Western, and then most people associate Ruger with that. And Ruger, continues on the line. And it's not until 1955 that Colt realizes maybe we should make our own firearm again. And so they do continue as well down the line, and they've got a second generation and a third generation associated with the company today, although that company changes hands a lot. So you see what Colt started with his kind of little messy business practices, you see that kind of continue. The company does really well, it doesn't do so well, it does really well, it doesn't do so well. But they do get involved in this replica market, and the replica market really just gets bigger and bigger and bigger as you go through the later part of the 20th century, and it's still quite popular today. And I think, what, I'm going to stop there, and we could talk about plenty of other things in the questions.
Okay, Ashley, thanks very much. That's fascinating. What you mentioned, and Jeff Beeler put into the chat box. Well, I should say I've also put in a couple of links to some things that Ashley has done. But Jeff Beeler's comment is worth mentioning right now, because he mentions what I neglected to mention, which is that you have a very informative and entertaining, according to Jeff, podcast called History Unloaded. And it's he says it's a podcast about firearms history from curators desperate to say more than we can fit in on a label. So listen in and hear us think out loud about history, museums, culture, and the occasional John Moses Browning wisecrack. And there's a link.
You definitely do listen.
So I wonder what are the wisecracks that we're talking about here?
Oh, John Moses Browning wisecracks. I should be careful because I work with the Browning family on an exhibition right now. But
all right.
No. It's just we joke about a lot of his design. There's a lot of really interesting history with the early Mormon church, which we talk about a lot, and then some of their conflict with different companies in the 20th century. It's again far more dramatic than you would expect.
Amazing. Wow. Interesting. So a couple of questions, and again, I encourage people to just put in questions. We had a couple come in here, and Christian, no surname, mentions or asked, did the two brands have different markets because of the difference in firepower? And I'm not sure which brands he's talking about, but I'm sure you can fill it in. He says that the small 22 seems more suited for everyday civilian carry rather than a powerful military handgun, such as a larger Army Colt Revolver revolver. I beg your pardon. So differences in firepower, I assume there will be, since the calibers will be different.
Oh yeah, very, very much so. The little 22, as I say, was extremely puny, but it was very popular. I think that when they first, 3 months after the building that Smith and Wesson made for making this factory, they got an order of 500 from South America, and then London and the U.S. and they were getting orders hundreds each month. But they were not from military people; they're from people willing to stick it in their pockets, who for last ditch defense or for mischief, I suppose. But they
Or
were
ladies.
or ladies. Yes, the purse. Oh, that would be perfect. Perfect muff pistol. You can put it inside there. You're ready to do what you need to do in such circumstances. Though Smith and Wesson decided to try to get a little bit into the military market by producing a model number 2, which was a little bigger. It operated much the same way, though it didn't have seven shots. I think it was just 6. That it was a little more powerful, still not enough to carry in a holster for serious work, but maybe as a backup gun. And that ended up selling to the military as well as civilians. Smith and Wesson eventually got into serious military revolvers, but in this early stages, they were going for different folks.
Well, and just to add a quick kind of addition to that, this period as well during the revolver market is also, you see a shift in carry practices with firearms. And so typically people were open carrying their firearms around this time frame. So you weren't worried necessarily about having to conceal something. But then there's a transition into conceal carry, which plays a role in the kind of early 1800s questions of, should you be allowed to open carry? Should you be allowed to conceal carry? And so you definitely get a different market in that respect if you're wanting to open carry, and obviously something more compact like this early Smith and Wessons or the other, the Remington Beals and the other smaller guns. So there's also kind of a shift in mindset about what carrying a firearm for defense means. And then that also what that means for the country, individual states. Totally different market, but then also similar, because in a lot of respects, it's still defense. It's just a different way to go about it.
So maybe just to follow up on that, maybe John, you're being the lawyer, you could elaborate on this. As we all know, there's a lot of debate about what does the Second Amendment actually grant citizens to do, and I can see as this market shifted from military and markets to mainly civilian, there had to have been some interesting debates about what the Second Amendment actually means and the time that those patterns of firearm ownership were changing. I have no idea what the answer would be, but John, Ashley, do you have any thoughts?
Ashley might have I've never litigated the Second Amendment. I've certainly read some material about it. Though a lot of people weren't really, first of all, way back then, you weren't sure that the Second Amendment applied to the states. Mm-hmm. So that's something that came about relatively recently, well, actually within this century. But there were various local laws that governed carry, which maybe Ashley knows more about than I do.
So this conversation is a quagmire that we don't have time for today, but it is something that's incredibly relevant. And there are a lot of early state laws, post-enactment laws to the Second Amendment that look into how you interpret the Second Amendment, both federally and then also locally. And then I also like to point out that this idea of a military gun versus a civilian gun is a lot murkier through pretty much all of that history, because a lot of times the better guns ended up in civilian hands because it just, for a number of reasons, didn't apply to military tactics at the time. And the reason why I say it's been kind of a fascinating conversation is because, I'll just real quick, last year there was a Supreme Court decision on firearms, and that Supreme Court decision created a test for identifying the constitutional constitutionality of firearms laws. And then I like to say that's not our call, that's the court's call ultimately. But within that test, it does actually look at available technology specifically around the founding era, so around the Second Amendment, but then also around the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which they call the second founding era. And so right now, the courts are having a back and forth with success on both sides to have the conversation of what technology was in existence, and then also what laws were in existence to see if there are any laws that they consider analogous or comparable to modern laws. So the answer to that is that it's complicated, and it's been really fascinating to watch over the past year. And it ultimately is up to the courts to decide, was the technology comparable enough? Were the laws comparable enough? And that's kind of where they're at right now with the interpretation.
Yeah, she's referring to the Bruin decision, which was talk about a landmark. That was certainly one, and that you've had historians and lower courts and obviously lawyers trying to figure out, okay, exactly what is covered by that, what would be okay, and you're going to have all kinds of conflicting decisions coming down, and some people who are very much in favor of the Second Amendment and free liberalized carry laws have said that the Supreme Court's going to have to straighten out some of the Bruin language so we really understand what its limits are.
And interestingly enough, I mean, it is fascinating to see that revolvers and Winchesters are all a part of that conversation. You wouldn't expect it, but here we are.
Yeah. So coming back to the questions and the Q&A, actually Jeff Beeler has a couple of questions. We'll come back to his questions in just a moment. But Dave Peterson wants to know what the impact of European designs like the bolt action Mausers of the late 1880s, what influence did that have on American gun design and designers? Were they totally different, or to what extent was there cross-fertilization between the different manufacturers?
So Danny's my co-host on my podcast. This is another kind of moment where we talk about the designs, because we joke that, all major American gun designs or innovations ultimately started overseas in Europe. And it's not totally wrong, except for maybe the lever action, because you're completely right. You do see the bolt action as the early Dreisen needle gun happen overseas in Prussia. You do see early elements of that. And kind of the way that we've categorized it with a lot of the technology is that it's, it may originate overseas, but there's always an interplay between the technology and the conversation. Even early on, you may not think that there's a lot of interplay between Europe and the rest of, the rest of the overseas. That's a great, doing great, overseas and the United States. And we've sometimes said that, it may have been developed over there, but in America, a lot of the really innovative designers really refined it and made it commercially possible and commercially available, that then also trickled back around the world.
You'll find that interchangeable parts, for example, which was a major development for industry. In other words, one part could fit into a gun, one gun just as well as it would fit into another gun. That was really sort of started in France. You had people there, and I've forgotten the fellow's name who was mainly responsible for that. But Thomas
LeBlanc,
Jefferson,
I think.
Honoré, was it LeBlanc? Yeah,
Something
I think
like
you're right.
Butcher that name.
but Jefferson found that fascinating. But where it became more thoroughly developed was over here in the United States. Part of it, the problem was that the French Revolution came along and sort of stopped a lot of the creativity that was going on in France. But a person who really launched that was our friend Samuel Colt in his factories. He made a big pitch in the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition in London, which was a celebration of industry that Britain held for itself and everyone else, but America began to shine there. He said, "You know what? My guns are made by machine." And he was invited back to speak to a very high level engineering society in England about the American system of manufacture, which was called the armory practice because it began with guns. Anyway, But there's a lot of cross fertilization. I think Ashley touched on that, and the eureka moments are very rare in inventions. You have people contributing various things. Ashley mentioned the lever action rifle, which which Winchester became famous for. It started off in many people's minds with a fellow named Walter Hunt, who invented a self-loading rifle with a magazine underneath the barrel way back in the 1840s. And he never made any money on it, but the patents eventually he sold, and people like Smith and Wesson and Winchester made money on it. Anyway, one brief side note, Walter Hunt, who never made money on these things, he did invent one thing that people know about today. He was fiddling with a piece of wire, this gun inventor, trying to come up with a way to pay for the patent drawings that he had contracted for. And he had this little pin that it fitted into a hook. And he thought, I'd patent that. So he patented it. He called it a dress pin. But that became what we call the safety pin. So anyway, I'm sorry, a little bit off the track, but there's all this cross-fertilization of ideas and cartridges, guns, technology in general.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I always kind of talk when I talk to audiences that aren't necessarily knowledgeable in firearms, is that I feel like in today's society, we almost see firearms owners, firearms manufacturers as kind of over here, not necessarily fully integrated into, other parts of culture. But for pretty much all of firearms history, it has been integral to understanding everything, for better or for worse, and indifferent in a lot of cases. And so you do see the development of different technologies, shirts and Winchesters, safety pins and guns, car manufacturers. It really has been integral to understanding so many different things. And I think that's something that kind of gets lost a lot in today's kind of education of it.
Yeah, can I ask Ashley a question in light of what you're just talking about here? How in your experience, when you're going out there and talking to people and making that point, do you think people are becoming more aware of the role of firearms in the United States history, or acceptance of them?
Well, that's a loaded question.
Well, no, in the people you run into. Loaded question, sure.
Sorry, that was low hanging fruit.
Bad
Honestly,
pun.
I think it really depends. When we rebuilt the Cody Firearms Museum, right at the front of the museum, there are 3 display cases. And the first one is a holster and belt, cartridge belt that was made by Abercrombie and Fitch. Abercrombie and Fitch got their start in 1892 as a high-end luxury sporting company. Ultimately ending up having like an 11-story sporting facility, in New York City. So we have that, and then we have a M1 carbine stock from World War II made by Louisville Slugger, and then we have a firearm that belonged to Henry Ford that was given to him by Harvey Firestone. And we talk about the proliferation of Henry Ford visiting Winchester and being inspired to make his assembly line. And so we did that so that people who came to the Buffalo Bill Center of the West that might be going to our art museum, our Plains Indian Museum, our natural history museum would see something that maybe they could relate to, and entice them to kind of come in and learn that overall history. I would say it's still kind of hit or miss, though, with the larger population as to whether people know about Eli Whitney and his less successful ventures into firearms technology, or Henry Ford. I think that there's still kind of a lack of knowledge around that, but I would say it's better than when I started at Cody, which is like almost 15 years ago now.
Oh.
But it's still just something you don't really hear about a lot. I think the Abercrombie and Fitch documentaries maybe touched on their early days, but the more recent drama around the company, I think eclipsed the early history.
Say the least. There are a number of questions coming in about the impact of these changing patterns of firearm ownership on the social fabric of of the age. And I'll just read off a couple of the questions, and then I'll let you guys go for it. Let's see. So Jeff Beeler asked, what was the effect of revolvers on behavior of the West? Did people get nicer? Did more people get shot? What about shooting rattlesnakes? There's some commentary on how you shoot rattlesnakes. Jeff Beeler also asks about what exactly did the 22 Smith & Wesson get used for? Is that 22 short rounds still around? And some other questions. How was the West won before the revolver? Did people carry single shot pistols regularly? And what was the effect of the revolver on the West socially? So there's a whole grab bag of questions there. And just tell us what you think about that.
Well, you're asking sociological questions that probably are beyond my ken, but I certainly did they carry guns out west before the revolver? Oh yeah, sure. They carried whatever they could. There were when the Western movement began. Ashley can correct me if you're wrong, because I'm sure she has more knowledge about this than I do. People found out that when they were going out west, the light caliber, or relatively light caliber Kentucky rifles were not as powerful as what they needed. So they ended up using plains rifles, which were heavier guns, shot more powerful loads because they were bigger bore, carried on horseback. Also, people used what was called a pepper box pistol, which was popular in the United States and abroad, in which it was a collection of essentially barrels, like a revolver cylinder, except that each chamber was an entire barrel itself. And they were clumsy things. You did get multiple shots, but you couldn't aim worth a damn. And sometimes they'd all go off at once. And Mark Twain had some cute things to say about the pepper box, having the ability to intimidate people, and it would, as I say, would sometimes all go off at once, but they weren't accurate. I'm sorry. So that's about all I got to say. What do you think?
So all of that was, I'll add on to all of that. In terms of, there was a lot of questions, so I'm trying to make sure I can kind of touch on a lot of them. There's a lot that changes in the kind of post-Civil War period in terms of American culture. So you do get a lot more migration out west, and there is migration, out west earlier on, especially, and they are carrying, heavier plains rifles. Hawken rifles was kind of the name brand of the day. But you get more people going out west. So you get a lot of kind of clashes in culture. Obviously, we're aware of, the Native American clashes with the government. And you do also hear about those moments where there are examples of Native Americans having superior firepower. Although it is important to also mention that it was difficult sometimes for them to acquire ammunition because they had to be sold ammunition. And sometimes that when you move into a metallic cartridge and away from kind of being able to make it on your own, that is a limiting factor in some respects, depending on how much they were charging. And I know that from our Plains Indian Museum, sometimes people were charging significantly more. But you do kind of see a huge shift in culture in general. And by the turn of the 20th century, you really are starting to see the origins of kind of a modern day society. So you've got people moving out west, you've got people moving into cities. And so you culturally just see it's just different. And so you do see a lot of kind of interpersonal violence that does go on, but it's not a firearm specific ordeal. Actually, if you look at the early carry laws, firearms are like at the end, it's like, bully sticks and brass knuckles and daggers and a lot of words. I don't actually know what those things mean. But then you'll see something like cane guns and concealable revolvers, not necessarily larger revolvers. And so it's kind of across the board, things kind of change. I don't know if they get nicer. Where are we at in society today? Do we get nicer? But things are changing as a country, and we're industrializing, and we're becoming more and more like what we see in the modern day. And you do see increased violence in cities by the turn of the 20th century. And you do see kind of this panic that comes around, assassinations of William McKinley, for example, and this idea of kind of violence, organized crime. And that's where you also start to see, federal regulatory bureaus popping up to track crime across state lines. So that's all changing. I don't know if I would say the firearm specifically is a leader in that, but obviously it does come into it as society is changing. The one thing I do want to point out about the American West, John mentioned whatever you could bring, whatever you could afford is what people had out West. So you got Winchesters, you got Smith and Wessons, you got Remingtons. Then you also got really cheap foreign copies of Smith and Wessons, Remingtons, Colts and Winchesters, and people would buy cheap post-war weapons surplus. So guns that they carried on the battlefield, they would be able to buy those at low rates. So you do see kind of a very diverse range of firearms that are available in the West. But I actually, and I'm not trying to say anything bad since this is the name of the talk, but winning the West is probably one of my more frustrating terms in terms of firearms, because it is a marketing slogan. It was a marketing slogan invented by Winchester in 1919. Winchester becomes a major military player during World War I. However, it also bankrupts them, and they will go into receivership in 1931. So they are very savvy coming out of the war, trying to kind of recoup their funds. And one of the things that they do is harken back to the American West. And they do an international marketing campaign where they say gun that won the West. And that's where you see that. So obviously firearms impact the West. They're very important to the West, but the idea of quote unquote winning the West is a marketing campaign that started with Winchester. And if I remember correctly, I've never really looked into it on my own, but the late Herbert House, who is a amazing historian, specifically Colt historian, I think that he said the Colt terminology about a gun that won the West wasn't until the 1980s. Could be totally wrong about that, but I know he said it was far later than the Winchester one. Oh, and rattlesnakes? I don't know. I live in Arizona, and I haven't shot a rattlesnake. My husband has, though.
Yes, someone mentioned that light shot works and tobacco spitting as well. That's from the comments. So John asks a technical question. Obviously, there are a variety of calibers and for firearms, and he asked, could you discuss the significance of caliber evolution and what the expected advantages were? What were people paying attention to, so forth?
I'm not sure I understand what with the.
I'll just read the question verbatim. Can you discuss the significance of caliber evolution and what the expected advantages were? So, what did the 38 have over the 22? And that sort of thing?
I'm not so sure I can answer that, at least off the top of my head. I mean, the what was important for potency was both the caliber and, of course, the powder and the ability to deliver whatever projectile you put in it. Obviously, a 22 is not going to have a whole lot of power. You can make it very fast, but the little tiny things are not going to work. And you could also have a big caliber that doesn't have a lot of powder behind it. But for example, you have, I guess, you had 58 caliber muskets, rifled muskets in the Civil War that were powered by loose powder. I'm not sure how they chose individual calibers, because you had 44s and you had then 45s. Sometimes the ammunition in one revolver would not go properly into the others. I think Colt and Smith and Wesson had a problem with ammunition that would not work. Smith and Wesson ammunition would work in a Colt revolver 1873, but the Colt 1873 wouldn't work in Smith and Wesson version because it was too large. But there were abundant different calibers that were made, and you also had a 45 caliber gun in the, let's say, in the era of the Indian Wars. was more powerful than, let's say, a 58 caliber musket from the Civil War, I think. Because it had a different kind, it had more powder behind it, and it was more accurate. Ashley, can you correct me on any of this?
No, you're good.
Okay.
For ammunition, and I actually love this question because I feel like ammunition history gets downplayed a lot, but the firearm is one part of it and the ammunition is another. And the initial big change in ammunition comes through the shape of the projectile. Although the earliest of firearms are shooting out all kinds of stuff. But when you actually get to your standard projectile, initially you've got a round musket ball. And the round ball is not necessarily as accurate. And that also comes into play with a development called rifling, which is spiral lands in grooves that spins the projectile, kind of like a football is always the example I hear. But rifling is invented in 1450 in Germany, and the round musket ball reigns supreme until the 1800s. And you can utilize a round ball in rifling, but it has to fit perfectly. So this goes to that conversation too about civilians sometimes having superior technology. And because the round ball had to fit perfectly in order to pick up the spiral lands and grooves, that slowed down loading time. And so a lot of times you saw in the military, they would stick with what they call smooth bore, meaning there's no rifling in the barrel. And then by the early 1800s, you get a conically shaped I almost said cartridge, but it's not a cartridge, a conically shaped projectile that you'll see, fully in place by the Civil War. And that, conical shape allows for you to pick up rifling a lot easier. So that's when you start to see rifling also play a much bigger role in the military, even though it's been around since the 1400s. So projectile shape, and that shape continues to evolve. You get conical shape, and a little bit later than that, you'll get kind of a pointy shape. They call a Spitzer bullet. And all of that plays a role. As John said, all the powder plays a role. And then that conversation that I had about the diversification of product lines. Now you don't need one gun fits all. That's where you also see ammunition, really a lot of different ammunition coming into play, because you've got your 22 for target shooting. You've got your 22 for concealed carry for very specific purposes, but then you have, your 45. And then, Colt and Smith and Wesson didn't exactly want to play in each other's pools. So that's where you get the 45 not fitting. People call it a long Colt, but that's actually not the, official name for it. But that's where you see people starting to decide, I need this caliber for this purpose. Hunting plays a huge role in that, especially in the post-Civil War period, where you'll see very nuanced calibers. So you'll see, not just a 45, but a 45-70, and you'll see the different kind of calculations of powder for very specific types of game, or, whatever you're trying to you're hitting a target. And that whole muzzle velocity conversation also comes in as kind of a play up of what you need. And as a little fun fact here, I don't know, fun, but Winchester is probably one of the biggest names. Remington also plays a really big role in ammunition production, but Winchester is successful financially because of its ammo production and its ammo development. But you don't hear about that as often. And then you do see cross-pollination where you've got a Winchester model 1873 and 4440, and you see a whole line of Colt model 1873s and 4440. So you don't have to carry different rounds for everything. So it's a very, very important part. And as you get the ability to mass manufacture and diversify, you get more options in terms of ammo for specific purposes.
You mentioned the rifling. One way that some of the early rifles got around, the early shooters got around the need to have that ball fit tightly, especially in the Kentucky rifles, they put a patch around the ball that they would then shove down the muzzle, and that would hold it tightly, and you'd get more accuracy. Though that is a laborious process, as you can see. Somebody asked about, I think the 22, whether you could still get 22 with that little thing. I don't think you can, but you can get what's called the 22 short ammunition, little puny little guns. They're inexpensive. Inexpensive cartridges. They're produced. The 22 long rifle that you can get, which is again a very light powered gun. It's still has the little H on the back, and the reason for the H is it was named for Henry, for Benjamin Tyler Henry, who invented the Henry rifle that made Winchester's main fortune. So you can still get that kind of ammunition. Whether you can for this little baby, I doubt it.
There are
I wouldn't
people
want
that
to
make
shoot
it.
it anyway. Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
There was
But first to make the disclaimer of, this is not an official statement that you can go and fire ammo out of a historic gun. You should visit a gunsmith that is a specialist in that. But they do make, lots of people shoot historic guns if they're stable enough. But then you can also get reduced powder, so reduced strength. I have a Mossberg Brownie. It's this little 4-barreled gun that looks like a semi-auto, but it's not. It's a tip up similar to a early Smith and Wesson. And it's a 22 and is short, and I have reduced power cartridges so that I can fire it.
There was a company that was making replica ammunition using old-fashioned black powder. There still are some, but there's one I particularly liked, seems to have gone out of business, called 10X, but there are some other ones that are still around. Whether they make actually, I would love to try to shoot this thing, but
go to a gunsmith first.
I will. I got a good one here. He'll make me sign a waiver, though.
Always.
Yes.
We talked about litigious culture.
Oh, yeah.
So before we close, there's at least one technical question here. A couple more have addressed this issue of the 22 short round, but Tim Leonard, he's been sitting there waiting patiently about interchangeable parts, and he mentions that Eli Whitney and Honoré LeBlanc were inventing interchangeable parts right at about the same time. But were they working independently from one another, or did Whitney actually appropriate the idea from LeBlanc?
I don't know whether they were working independently or not. Whitney had claimed to make interchangeable parts. As a matter of fact, that's the way he got some contracts, was that he said, I could make these interchangeable. Well, he really couldn't. And he's been, the popular literature had always accredited him with having invented interchangeable parts. And there was, I've forgotten the name of the author that came out with it back in the 1960s, who finally said, let's just stop this business about Whitney and interchangeable parts. He didn't invent them. Maybe he moved the process along a little bit, but no, he did not invent them. Honoré LeBlanc, it wasn't a complete success. And also through the whole period of into the 20th century and beyond, people weren't making completely identical parts. Now, what is an interchangeable part? Is it something that you could put in so it would make it work? You were doing that to some extent with clocks in the 19th century, but the gun mechanisms tended to be, interestingly enough, more precise, more demanding than some of the clocks. So you get somewhat interchangeable parts, but they still needed to be fit. They still needed fitting work, and it wasn't until much later that you could really consider properly interchangeable parts.
Yeah, Eli, I have thoughts about Eli Whitney that we won't totally get into today, but I did actually get to meet a descendant of Eli Whitney, and I was worried as I was speaking about Eli Whitney, and she agreed that, he was a huckster, because Eli Whitney didn't invent the cotton gin either, and spent a lot of money and time trying to defend his patents around the country. And they actually, when he got the contract in the 1790s to make 10,000 muskets, and then he didn't actually fulfill that on time at all. And then magically he invented interchangeable parts to appease Jefferson.
That's right.
But in his success of it, but he ends up, they think the reason he took the government contract was so that he could continue to try to make the cotton gin successful, but you don't necessarily hear that part of it. John Hall is probably one of the people more credited with interchangeable parts in the gun world, which is early 1800s. But Eli Whitney, that isn't that so silly that you learned that in school still, but we all know that's not that's not real. Well, I guess we don't all know that's not real, but we should know that, because that's one of those moments where history is far more exciting than the little kind of easy story we tell.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of myths taught in schools now, but that's a subject for another day, I think. So let's close things out. Before I turn over the webinar to our guests for their last words on this, let me just mention a couple of things. If we didn't get to your question, or if a burning question comes up, by all means, send them to me at turner@nas.org, and I'll try to get them to our panelists today. This webinar will, of course, be on YouTube, and the comments section there are a good place to put questions as well for everyone. And when you get the email informing you where the thing is, please do keep the National Association of Scholars in mind. We're a great group. Maybe you'll be prompted to join us if you're not already a member, and you can help us by actually supporting, by sharing this and other things with your friends, neighbors, and countrymen. And Jeff Beeler says you can also ask questions to Ashley directly on her podcast. And so thank you for that, Jeff. And I'll turn the webinar over to the two of you for any last words that you have. John, why don't you go first?
Okay. One of the things that struck me in researching gun barons, I've always been interested in old firearms, as you can probably guess. But one of the things that I was not aware of until I started to really dig into it was how bold these characters were. They're very different individuals. How much time do I have to talk? And I'll pay attention to your thing this time.
Say what you like.
Okay. Is they're very different. I mean, Colt, as Ashley said, he was not the nicest guy in the world. He would spend other people's money. He was not completely honest. He would stab you in the back if he could. You had Oliver Winchester, who's a ruthless businessman, and you had a fellow named Christopher Minor Spencer, who we didn't talk about because he didn't have anything to do with revolvers, but who was a passionate inventor. That's all he wanted to do was invent. And he didn't care about making money. But what struck me about all these characters is that how bold they were. They took risks in ways that I admire, because I'm not a risk taker. I've always told my children to be bold, but these guys would stick their necks out. Several of them, Colt included, started their businesses without any building, without any workforce, without anything that would justify making a contract with the government. Colt did that. Say Spencer, he invented a repeating rifle that competed with Winchester during the Civil War. His company was backed by others. They had a contract the early part of the Civil War to make repeating rifles. They had no workforce, no machinery, again, nothing except the contract to make the guns and a deadline to turn them out. They ended up renting a second floor of a piano factory in Boston and making the guns that were required of them. There was a little tiny firm called Robbins and Lawrence up in Windsor, Vermont, that just decided, well, government wants, this is back in the 1844, government wants 10,000 rifle muskets. We can make it. Well, they couldn't. So they got a contract to make them. Again, bought some land at a tributary of the Connecticut River, which could produce the water power that would make their wheels turn. Built a building, got some people involved, got the machinery, and produced the guns. I think 18 months, well ahead of time. That to me is an extraordinary thing. That kind of vibrant creativity, the dynamism that was part of this country, not just in the gun making world, but it was in the fabric and the soul of this country way back then. Sometimes parts of it, this country, I think it still is, but that was very striking to me. Even rapscallions like Colt are admirable for that. Anyway, thank you.
Ashley, final thoughts.
Oh, goodness. I mean, I'd like to second what you said. I mean, there are so many personalities within firearms history, and I'm sure that it goes across the board for all kind of industries. But I think the most fascinating part of studying firearms, as someone who also didn't grow up around guns, I had nothing to do with guns until I was 18 and got my first museum internship, where I had to catalog like 200 guns, and I had never held one before in my life. So, not coming from that world, I have been struck by the figures throughout history. That you don't know. Thomas Bennett is probably should be more famous than Oliver Winchester. He made Winchester successful. And in addition to being a designer and running the company, he was married to his sister-in-law, wrote really racy love letters when he was overseas. And he was a professional wrestler. So you get a lot of dynamic kind of personalities there. But I think the thing that was so striking to me, and I know I mentioned it once before, but I'll do it in kind of a more modern, quote unquote, sense, is the interconnected nature of firearms history to the rest of society. So, I've mentioned the, industry side of things and companies that dabbled in firearms and firearms companies that dabbled outside of firearms. But when I was in graduate school, I studied armed feminism and leftist firearms activism from the 1960s through the 1970s. And what I found really fascinating about that was that in early feminist presses, and at UC Berkeley, you could actually take a firearms course on UC Berkeley campus. They were putting out these pamphlets. The one on Berkeley campus, I have it somewhere behind me, is handguns and self-defense for radicals, revolutionaries, and easy riders. But what strikes me about these pamphlets they're putting out is the rhetoric, the words that the words they're using for the justification of them wanting to carry is very similar to a lot of people today who you might think are on the opposite side of those conversations. And in terms of the feminists, this part of the second wave of feminists, and there was certainly a part that was opposed to firearms, but there was a part that was pro-gun, and their narrative was to arm themselves, be protected, be safe from rape during the sexual revolution. And what I think is so fascinating about that is that is the exact same rhetoric when you read their pamphlets from 1970 to when you read the NRA's Refuse to be a Victim program in the 1990s. And I gave a talk at a rally once, and I always say, be careful when you invite a historian to a rally. But I said the thing that I find so fascinating and I love so much about that is when you think about today's culture, oftentimes feminists, scoff at female gun owners and female gun owners scoff at feminists, but they have each other to thank for the views that they hold today. And I think that is so powerful to realize that somebody you may think is completely opposite of you may have actually inspired your own narrative, your own beliefs today. And that kind of interconnected nature with firearms is always, and it still continues, into the present. And I like to see that, and I like to surprise people because I think it allows there to be a better dialogue on the whole thing.
Well, John Bainbridge and Ashley Levinsky, many thanks for a fascinating discussion. And I think dialogue is the word to take away from this today. So thank you all for joining us on today's American Innovations webinar series. And until next time, I bid you adieu.